In the frozen hell outside the Russian fortress of Narva, 38,000 professional soldiers stood ready to crush an army 1/4 their size. Behind the walls, the Russian commander looked out at his overwhelming force and smiled. This was going to be a slaughter. His enemy was led by an 18-year-old boy who had never commanded troops in battle. A teenager against the might of the Russian Empire. What happened next would become one of the most shocking military upsets in European history. That boy didn't just survive, he didn't just escape. He attacked, and in the chaos of a blinding snowstorm, with visibility down to nearly zero, that teenage king led a charge that would shatter the Russian army so completely that survivors would speak of it in terrified whispers for decades. But here's the thing about the Battle of Narva. It wasn't the end of this story. It was barely the beginning. Because that boy Charles XII of Sweden would spend the next 18 years waging war against 3 empires simultaneously, marching his armies across the frozen landscapes of Northern Europe, winning battle after impossible battle, becoming the terror of every throne from Copenhagen to Moscow. He would come within striking distance of conquering Russia itself. He would become a legend, a myth, a cautionary tale about the thin line between genius and madness, and then he would lose everything. This is the story of the Great Northern War, the story of how one teenage king's obsession with glory nearly rewrote the map of Europe and how that same obsession ultimately destroyed him. To understand how a teenager ended up fighting 3 empires at once, you need to understand what Sweden was in the late 17th century. And frankly, if you're imagining the Sweden of today neutral, peaceful, famous for meatballs and flat-pack furniture, you need to completely reset your mental image. The Sweden of 1697 was a military superpower, a genuine, terrifying, continental powerhouse. Over the previous century, Swedish kings had built an empire that dominated the Baltic Sea and included not just modern-day Sweden and Finland, but also chunks of what is now Germany, Estonia, Latvia, and more. The Baltic Sea was practically a Swedish lake, and the Swedish military was considered pound for pound the finest fighting force in Europe. This was a nation that had produced Gustavus Adolphus, the legendary lion of the North who had revolutionized warfare. During the 30 Years' War, Swedish soldiers were renowned for their discipline, their aggression, and their absolutely terrifying cavalry charges. When Swedish forces appeared on a battlefield, experienced generals got nervous. But here's the problem with empires. Everyone else wants what you have. By the 1690s, Sweden was surrounded by neighbors who looked at all that Baltic coastline, all those valuable ports, all that territory, and thought the same thing: that should be mine. To the south, there was Saxony, Poland, ruled by Augustus II, a man known to history as Augustus the Strong, and that nickname wasn't ironic. Augustus was reportedly capable of bending horseshoes with his bare hands and breaking the necks of foxes with his fingers. He was also ambitious, flamboyant, and absolutely convinced that he deserved a bigger kingdom. He had his eye on Swedish Livonia, modern-day Latvia, and Estonia. To the west, there was Denmark-Norway, ruled by Frederick IV. The Danes had been Sweden's rivals for centuries, fighting war after war over control of Scandinavia. Frederick wanted to reclaim territories Sweden had taken from Denmark decades earlier, particularly the strategically crucial regions around the Sound, the narrow strait that controlled access to the Baltic Sea. And to the east, there was Russia. Now, in 1697, Russia wasn't yet the colossus it would become. But it was ruled by a man who intended to change that. Peter I, soon to be known as Peter the Great, was obsessed with modernizing Russia, with transforming it from a backward medieval kingdom into a European powerhouse. And the key to that transformation, Peter believed, was access to the sea. Specifically, access to the Baltic Sea, which meant he needed ports, which meant he needed Swedish territory. Peter was young, ambitious, and utterly ruthless. He had already suppressed rebellions with mass executions. He had already begun dragging Russia into the modern era through sheer force of will. And now he looked at the Swedish Empire and saw an opportunity. These three rulers, Augustus, Frederick, and Peter, began talking and plotting, and by 1699, they had formed a secret alliance. The plan was simple: attack Sweden simultaneously from three directions, overwhelm the empire before it could respond, carve up the Baltic territories among themselves. It was, on paper, a foolproof strategy. Sweden couldn't possibly fight three enemies at once. The Swedish military was good, but it wasn't that good. There was just one variable these three rulers had failed to account for. The King of Sweden was about to turn 17. Charles XII became King of Sweden on April 5, 1697, when his father, Charles XI, died unexpectedly of stomach cancer. Charles was 14 years old. Now, you might imagine that a 14-year-old suddenly inheriting a throne would be overwhelmed. That there would be regents, advisors, people making decisions on his behalf. And at first, that's exactly what happened. A regency council was established to rule until Charles came of age. Charles hated it. From the very beginning, those who observed the young king noted something unusual about him. He wasn't interested in the things teenage boys were supposed to be interested in. He showed little patience for court ceremonies, for diplomatic niceties, for the elaborate social rituals of royal life. What Charles liked was hunting and riding and military exercises, and stories about his great predecessors, about Gustavus Adolphus, about Alexander the Great, about the warrior kings of the past. Charles was also stubborn, phenomenally, almost pathologically stubborn. When he decided something, that was it. No debate, no discussion, no compromise. This trait would define his entire reign, for better and for worse. In November 1697, barely 7 months after his father's death, the 15-year-old Charles declared himself of age and assumed full power. The Regency Council was dissolved. Charles XII was now the absolute ruler of the Swedish Empire. He was 15. Most boys his age were worried about apprenticeships or their first awkward romantic encounters. Charles was commanding one of Europe's great powers, and he was about to walk into a trap. The Allied powers launched their coordinated attack in early 1700. Augustus struck first, sending Saxon troops to besiege the city of Riga in Swedish Livonia in February. A month later, Frederick IV of Denmark-Norway invaded the Swedish-allied Duchy of Holstein-Gottorp, and Peter of Russia, still finalizing peace with the Ottoman Empire, prepared to unleash his forces on Swedish territories in the eastern Baltic. The trap was sprung. Sweden was under attack from 3 directions at once. In Stockholm, advisors panicked. The situation seemed impossible. How could Sweden possibly defend itself against 3 major powers simultaneously? The logical thing to do would be to negotiate, to try to buy off one enemy while fighting the others, to make the best of a terrible situation. Charles XII had different ideas. The 17-year-old king gathered his council and calmly announced his strategy. He would not negotiate. He would not buy peace. He would attack. He would knock out each enemy one by one, and he would start with Denmark. It was audacious to the point of lunacy, but Charles wasn't interested in safe options. Working with remarkable speed, Charles assembled an invasion force. He secured the support of England and the Dutch Republic, who had their own reasons for wanting to keep the Baltic balance of power intact, and who provided naval support. And in August 1700, just months after the war began, Charles XII personally led an amphibious assault on the Danish island of Zealand. This wasn't commanding from behind the lines. Charles went in with his troops. He was among the first to land on the beaches, wading through the surf with sword in hand. He was 17 years old, and he was leading an amphibious invasion against a major European power. The Danish were caught completely off guard. They had expected Sweden to be paralyzed, to be desperately trying to defend multiple fronts. They had not expected a teenage king to come crashing onto their shores. Frederick IV, suddenly facing a Swedish army threatening Copenhagen itself, folded almost immediately. Within 2 weeks of the invasion, Denmark had sued for peace. The Treaty of Travendel, signed on August 18, 1700, knocked Denmark out of the war entirely. Charles XII had been at war for roughly 6 months. He had already eliminated one of his 3 enemies. It was a stunning debut. The teenage king had shown remarkable decisiveness and personal courage. He had moved faster than anyone thought possible. He had won, but the real test was still coming. While Charles had been dealing with Denmark, the Russian siege of Narva had begun. Narva was a small but strategically important Swedish fortress in Estonia, right on the Russian border. Peter the Great, finally free from his war with the Ottomans, had sent an army of approximately 35,000 troops to capture it. The garrison defending Narva numbered around 2,000 men. The math was brutal. The Russians had more than 15 soldiers for every Swedish defender. As autumn descended and the siege dragged on, Charles XII faced a critical decision. The obvious move was to wait, to gather strength, to let the Russians wear themselves out against Narva's walls while building an overwhelming force to relieve the city in the spring. That's what a cautious commander would do. That's what experienced generals advised. Charles chose differently. He decided to march immediately to Narva with whatever forces he could muster. He would relieve the siege now, in the dead of winter, regardless of the odds. The force Charles managed to assemble numbered roughly 10,000 men. Against 35,000 Russians, some accounts put the Russian numbers even higher, closer to 40,000. When Charles's army arrived outside Narva on November 30th, 1700, the situation looked suicidal. The Swedish force was outnumbered at least 3-1. The Russians were entrenched, protected by their siege works. They were well supplied, well positioned, and commanded by officers who couldn't quite believe their luck. The Swedish king had delivered himself into a trap of his own making. Then the snowstorm came. On the morning of November 30th, a fierce blizzard swept across the battlefield, driving snow directly into the faces of the Russian troops. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. The Russians huddled in their positions, barely able to see their own comrades a few feet away. Charles saw opportunity. With the wind and snow at their backs, the Swedish forces attacked directly into the storm. The Russians, blinded by the weather, had almost no warning. Swedish columns smashed into the Russian lines before they could organize any coherent defense. What followed was less a battle than a catastrophe. The Russian army, spread thin along miles of siege works, was caught completely by surprise. Unit after unit collapsed under the Swedish assault. Soldiers fled in panic, trampling each other, drowning in the river as bridges collapsed under the weight of retreating men. Charles XII, 18 years old, led the charge personally. He was in the thick of the fighting, sword in hand. His horse shot out from under him at one point, continuing on foot. He showed absolutely no concern for his own safety, a pattern that would continue throughout his reign. By the time the battle ended, the Russian army had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. Somewhere between 10,000 and 12,000 Russians were dead or captured. The remaining survivors had scattered in total disorder. Swedish losses were around 700 men. At the age of 18, Charles XII had just won one of the most lopsided victories in military history. The impact was seismic. Across Europe, people suddenly knew who Charles XII was. This wasn't just a teenage king anymore. This was a military genius, a new Alexander, a commander who could apparently achieve the impossible. Songs were written about him. His portrait was distributed across the continent. Peter the Great, humiliated, scrambled to rebuild his shattered forces. Charles stood victorious on the field at Narva, master of the moment, terror of his enemies. And this is where everything started to go wrong. The logical thing to do after Narva would have been to pursue the Russians. Peter's army was destroyed. His military reforms had barely begun. Russia was vulnerable in a way it might never be again. A swift campaign into Russian territory in 1701 could have knocked Peter out of the war entirely, forcing him to accept Swedish terms. Every strategic consideration pointed toward Russia. Every opportunity screamed that this was the moment to strike east. Charles XII turned south instead, his target, Augustus the Strong and Saxony, Poland. Why? The answer reveals something crucial about Charles's psychology, something that would shape the entire rest of the war. Charles wasn't primarily interested in strategic advantage. He wasn't interested in optimal outcomes or cost-benefit analysis. Charles was interested in one thing above all else: honor. And Augustus had insulted his honor. Augustus had attacked Sweden while pretending to be at peace. Augustus had tried to steal Swedish territory through treachery. In Charles's mind, this demanded not just military defeat, but complete and utter humiliation. Augustus didn't just need to lose. He needed to be destroyed, publicly, completely, personally. This wasn't rational strategic thinking. This was something more primal. Charles took the attack on his realm as a personal offense, and he would spend years he didn't have pursuing vengeance against Augustus when Russia, the far greater threat, was given time to recover. It was, in retrospect, a catastrophic mistake, but Charles couldn't see it that way. He could only see the insult, and he would have his satisfaction. In the summer of 1701, Swedish forces crossed into Poland, beginning a campaign that would consume the next 6 years of Charles's life. 6 years of marching, fighting, pursuing Augustus across the vast territories of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. 6 years while Peter the Great rebuilt his army, reformed his military, and slowly began to reverse every Swedish gain in the eastern Baltic. The pursuit of Augustus the Strong would become Charles XII's magnificent obsession and the first great blunder of his reign. The Poland that Charles invaded in 1701 was not like other European kingdoms. It was, technically, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, one of the largest states in Europe by territory, stretching from the Baltic to near the Black Sea, but it was also one of the most politically dysfunctional. The Polish crown was elective, not hereditary. The nobility, the Szlachta, held enormous power and jealously guarded their privileges against any attempt at centralized authority. The king, whoever he happened to be, ruled more by persuasion than command. Royal armies were chronically underfunded. Royal authority was chronically weak. Augustus, too, wasn't even Polish. He was the elector of Saxony, ruler of a wealthy German state who had essentially bought the Polish crown through bribes and political maneuvering. Many Polish nobles resented him. Many saw him as a German interloper who cared more about his Saxon interests than Polish welfare. Charles XII saw all of this dysfunction and recognized an opportunity. He didn't just want to defeat Augustus in battle, although he would do that too, repeatedly. He wanted to remove Augustus from the Polish throne entirely and replace him with someone more cooperative. A puppet king who would turn Poland from an enemy into an ally. It was an ambitious goal. Some would say an unrealistic goal. Charles didn't care. He was 18 years old. He had just won 2 wars in a single year, and he believed he could do anything. The Polish campaign began with the same pattern that had defined Charles's early victories: speed, aggression, overwhelming personal courage. In July 1701, Swedish forces met a combined Saxon-Polish army at the Battle of Klisza. The odds were against Charles. His roughly 12,000 troops faced perhaps 24,000 enemies. But the Swedes had advantages that didn't show up in the simple numbers. They had superior discipline, superior cavalry tactics, and they had Charles XII leading from the front. The battle was a masterclass in aggressive cavalry warfare. Charles personally led charge after charge into the enemy lines. At one point, his horse was killed under him again, and he continued fighting on foot until another mount could be found. The Swedish cavalry shattered the Saxon-Polish forces, killing thousands and sending the rest fleeing in disorder. It was another stunning victory. Augustus retreated. Charles pursued. This became the rhythm of the next several years. Augustus would gather forces, attempt to make a stand, and Charles would smash him. The Battle of Pultusk in 1703, the Siege of Thorn, engagement after engagement, always ending the same way: Swedish victory, Saxon retreat, and Charles pushing deeper into Poland. But there was a problem. Poland was vast. Impossibly, frustratingly vast. And Augustus, whatever his faults as a military commander, was proving remarkably difficult to finish off. Every time Charles thought he had cornered his enemy, Augustus slipped away. Every time the Swedish king closed in for the killing blow, the Saxon elector managed to escape, retreat to his German territories, raise new troops, and return. It was like trying to catch smoke with your bare hands. Meanwhile, the Polish nobility was splitting into factions. Some supported Augustus. Others, seeing which way the wind was blowing, began to support Charles. The country descended into civil war, with Swedish troops caught in the middle of a Polish political nightmare. Charles had a solution. If Augustus couldn't be caught, he could at least be replaced. The Swedish king threw his support behind a young Polish nobleman named Stanisław Leszewski, engineering his election as the new king of Poland in 1704. On paper, this was a clever move. Stanisław was pliable, grateful, and entirely dependent on Swedish military support. He would be a reliable ally, turning the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth from an enemy into a client state. Charles had essentially conquered Poland through politics rather than pure military force. In practice, it created a mess. Large portions of the Polish nobility refused to accept Stanisław. They remained loyal to Augustus. Poland now had two kings, two rival governments, and a civil war that Charles's army would have to keep fighting indefinitely. The Swedish king had expected a quick campaign. Knock out Augustus, install a puppet, move on. Instead, he found himself trapped in Poland, year after year, fighting a war that wouldn't end. While Charles was chasing Augustus through the Polish wilderness, something was happening in the east that would ultimately prove far more important than any battle in Poland. Peter the Great was learning. The humiliation at Narva had been devastating, but Peter was not the type of man to be destroyed by a single defeat. He was the type to study that defeat, understand what had gone wrong, and rebuild everything from the ground up, and that's exactly what he did. In the years after Narva, Peter launched the most ambitious military reform program Russia had ever seen. He recruited foreign officers to train his troops. He modernized equipment, improved supply systems, instituted brutal discipline. He created a professional standing army on the European model, replacing the semi-feudal forces that had collapsed so spectacularly in the snowstorm outside Narva. But Peter wasn't just rebuilding his army. He was building something else, to something that would come to symbolize his entire reign. In 1703, on swampy, inhospitable land near the mouth of the Neva River, Peter founded a new city. He called it St. Petersburg. It was built on territory that technically still belonged to Sweden, territory that Peter had no legal right to claim. But Peter didn't care about legal rights. He was making a statement. St. Petersburg was to be Russia's window to Europe, a modern, Western-style capital that would announce Russia's arrival as a European power. It was built through the forced labor of hundreds of thousands of workers, many of whom died in the brutal conditions. But it rose from the swamps nonetheless, a monument to Peter's vision and ruthlessness. The city's location was no accident. It was on the Baltic Sea. Peter was declaring, in stone and mortar, that Russia would have its access to the sea, that Russia would be a Baltic power, that the Swedish Empire's days of dominating these waters were numbered. Charles, stuck in Poland, paid little attention. He was focused on Augustus, on honor, on finishing what he had started. The threat to the east seemed distant, manageable, something he would deal with after he had achieved his vengeance. It was a miscalculation that would cost him everything. By 1706, the chase had finally reached its conclusion. Augustus, exhausted and increasingly desperate, had retreated to his hereditary territory of Saxony. Charles XII followed him. For the first time, the war left the chaotic wastes of Poland for the wealthy, civilized heartland of Germany. The invasion of Saxony was a different kind of warfare. This wasn't fighting across endless Polish plains or besieging crumbling frontier fortresses. Saxony was prosperous, developed, full of cities and resources. Charles's army, which had been living off the land for years, suddenly found itself in a region of plenty. The Swedish forces occupied Saxony with ruthless efficiency. They collected contributions to essentially enormous financial payments extracted from the population at sword point. They quartered troops in towns and villages. They made it absolutely clear that Saxony would continue to suffer until Augustus surrendered. And Augustus, finally, had nowhere left to run. In September 1706, the Saxon elector sent envoys to negotiate. The result was the Treaty of Ultranstadt, signed on September 24th. The terms were brutal. Augustus renounced his claim to the Polish throne. He recognized Stanisław Leszewski as the legitimate king of Poland. He broke his alliance with Peter the Great. He handed over Johann Pacul, a Livonian nobleman who had helped organize the anti-Swedish coalition in the first place. Pacul's fate would demonstrate the limits of Charles's mercy. The man was tried for treason, technically accurate, as he had originally been a Swedish subject and executed in the most gruesome manner imaginable. He was broken on the wheel, a medieval torture that involved shattering the victim's limbs with an iron bar, then leaving them to die slowly. It took hours. Charles XII had finally achieved his vengeance against Augustus the Strong. 6 years. 6 years of marching, fighting, bleeding to bring down one man who had dared to attack the Swedish Empire. But those 6 years had cost him something far more valuable than time. Here's the strategic reality that Charles had ignored while pursuing his personal vendetta. In 1701, when Charles had turned south toward Poland instead of east toward Russia, Peter the Great's military was a shambles. The army that had been shattered at Narva was barely beginning to reform. Russian control over the eastern Baltic was tenuous at best. A determined Swedish offensive could likely have forced Peter to the peace table. By 1706, everything had changed. Peter had used those 6 years brilliantly. His new army was larger, better trained, and better equipped than anything Russia had fielded before. Russian forces had gone on the offensive in the eastern Baltic, capturing key Swedish territories one by one. Swedish garrisons, stretched thin and unsupported while the main army was stuck in Poland, had fallen to Russian sieges. The great fortress of Narva, site of Charles's legendary victory, had been captured by the Russians in 1704. Other Swedish strongholds followed. The entire province of Ingria was in Russian hands. St. Petersburg continued to grow on what had been Swedish soil, and Charles's puppet, Stanisław Leszewski, controlled less of Poland than ever. Without Swedish troops to prop him up, his authority was collapsing. Augustus might have signed away his claim to the throne, but many Polish nobles still supported him, waiting for the moment when Swedish power might falter. Charles XII had spent 6 years achieving a personal triumph that was already unraveling. Meanwhile, the enemy that actually mattered to Russia had become stronger than ever. Now, finally, Charles turned his attention east. In the winter of 1707 to 1708, Charles XII prepared for the campaign that would define his legacy. The Swedish army that marched out of Saxony was impressive by any standard, approximately 40,000 men, the largest field army Charles had ever commanded. These were veterans, hardened by years of combat in Poland. Swedish infantry was still considered the finest in Europe, and Swedish cavalry remained terrifying. By pure military quality, this force was unmatched. The plan was simple in conception, impossibly ambitious in scope. Charles would invade Russia, march on Moscow, and force Peter the Great to accept Swedish terms. Just as he had broken Augustus, he would break Peter. Just as he had dictated peace in Saxony, he would dictate peace in the Kremlin. The army crossed into Russian territory in January 1708. The invasion of Russia had begun. Almost immediately, things started going wrong. Peter had learned from the experiences of the previous years, not just his own experiences, but from studying how other powers had failed against Sweden. He understood that he couldn't match Charles in open battle, not yet, not with his still developing army against Swedish veterans. So he chose a different approach. The Russians retreated. And as they retreated, they destroyed everything. This was scorched earth warfare on a scale that Charles had never encountered. Russian forces burned villages, slaughtered livestock, poisoned wells, carried off or destroyed every scrap of food they could find. The advancing Swedish army found nothing but ash and desolation. Charles had expected to live off the land, as he had throughout the Polish campaign. In Poland, even amid the chaos of civil war, there had been farms to plunder, granaries to seize, livestock to slaughter. Russia gave him nothing. The land itself seemed to be fighting against him. And then there was the weather. The winter of 1708 to 1709 was one of the coldest in recorded European history. Modern historians call it part of the Great Frost, a period of extreme cold that devastated crops across the continent. In the exposed Russian steppes, it was apocalyptic. Swedish soldiers, already weakened by hunger, began to freeze. Men collapsed on the march and never rose. Horses died by the hundreds. Fingers, toes, and ears were lost to frostbite. The army that had set out with such confidence was being slowly murdered by the Russian winter. Charles pressed on anyway. He couldn't turn back. His entire identity, his entire conception of himself, was built on the idea that he never retreated, never gave up, never showed weakness. To retreat now would be to admit defeat, and Charles XII did not admit defeat. So the army marched deeper into Russia, dying by inches. In the summer of 1708, Charles faced a critical decision that would seal his fate. The original plan had been to march directly on Moscow. But the army was in terrible shape, depleted, exhausted, desperate for supplies. Charles needed reinforcements, and a supply column under General Adam Ludwig Leuenhaupt was marching from the Baltic to join him. The column carried artillery, ammunition, and desperately needed provisions. Meanwhile, Ivan Mazepa, the hetman of the Ukrainian Cossacks, had made secret contact with Charles. Mazepa promised that if the Swedish king marched south into Ukraine, the Cossacks would rise in rebellion against Russian rule. He promised troops, supplies, and local support. He promised that Ukraine would greet Charles as a liberator. It was a gamble. The southern route would take Charles away from Moscow, away from the decisive blow against Russia. But it offered the prospect of reinforcement, of resupply, of local allies who could help sustain his campaign. Charles decided to turn south. He would link up with Mazepa's Cossacks, rebuild his strength in Ukraine, and resume the march on Moscow in the spring. It was a reasonable decision given the circumstances. But the circumstances were about to get dramatically worse. The supply column never arrived. Lewenhaupt's force was intercepted by Russian troops at the Battle of Lesnaya in October 1708. The Swedish column was surrounded, outnumbered, and destroyed as an effective fighting force. Of the approximately 12,000 men who had set out with desperately needed supplies, only around 6,000 bedraggled survivors eventually reached Charles's army. The supplies, the artillery, the provisions, almost all of it was lost. Peter the Great called Lesnaya the mother of Poltava. He wasn't wrong. And Mazeppa's promised Cossack uprising, it never materialized. When the hetman finally joined Charles with his followers, he brought only a fraction of the forces he had promised. Most of the Cossacks, seeing which way the wind was blowing, chose to remain loyal to Russia. Mazeppa's capital at Baturin was stormed by Russian forces, its population massacred as a warning to anyone else who might consider rebellion. Charles XII was now trapped in Ukraine, far from Moscow, his army reduced to perhaps 20,000 effective troops, facing a Russian army that grew stronger every day. The master of victory was being slowly enveloped by catastrophe. Through the brutal winter of 1708 to 1709, the Swedish army struggled to survive. The cold was relentless. Swedish soldiers, lacking adequate winter clothing and shelter, died in their thousands. Disease swept through the camps. Food remained desperately scarce. The proud army that had terrorized Europe was becoming a skeleton of itself. And still Charles refused to retreat. Still he clung to the belief that one great battle, one decisive victory, would restore everything. His stubbornness, which had served him so well in his early campaigns, had become something darker. He couldn't adapt, couldn't recognize when circumstances had fundamentally changed, couldn't accept that some situations required retreat and compromise rather than endless attack. His officers begged him to pull back, to retreat to Poland and rebuild. Charles refused. The army would stay. The army would fight. In April 1709, the Swedish forces laid siege to the Ukrainian fortress of Poltava. It was a modest target. The garrison numbered only a few thousand men, but Charles needed a victory, any victory, to maintain morale and demonstrate that he was still capable of offensive action. The siege dragged on for weeks. Russian reinforcements were gathering. Peter the Great himself arrived to take command of the Russian army, which now numbered somewhere around 80,000 men. Charles had perhaps 18,000 men capable of fighting. The odds were nearly 5-1 against him. A rational commander would have recognized that the situation was hopeless. A rational commander would have retreated while there was still time. Charles was no longer capable of being that commander. He had built his entire identity on the idea that he could overcome any odds through sheer will and aggression. On June 28, 1709, he would put that belief to the final test. The Battle of Poltava began before dawn on a hot summer morning. Charles XII was in no condition to command. Just days earlier, during a reconnaissance mission, he had been shot through the foot. The wound was serious. The bullet had passed completely through his ankle, and he was unable to ride a horse or walk without assistance. He would command from a stretcher carried among his troops. This was, in itself, remarkable. Most commanders with such an injury would have delegated to subordinates. Charles insisted on being present, on being visible to his men, on leading even when he could barely move. The Swedish plan was characteristic of Charles's style, aggressive to the point of recklessness. The army would attack the Russian positions in the early morning, using the cover of darkness to approach, then smash through the enemy lines before they could fully respond. Speed and shock as always, but everything went wrong from the start. The Swedish columns became separated in the darkness. Communications broke down. Units that were supposed to attack together arrived at different times, allowing the Russians to deal with them piecemeal. The element of surprise, so crucial to the plan, was completely lost. And then the sun came up, and the Russians counterattacked. Peter's artillery opened fire with devastating effect, tearing gaps in the Swedish lines. The reformed Russian infantry, so different from the rabble that had fled at Narva 9 years earlier, stood firm. Russian cavalry swept around the Swedish flanks. The Swedish soldiers fought with their customary ferocity. Individual regiments performed acts of desperate heroism. But heroism couldn't overcome the fundamental mathematics of the situation. They were outnumbered, outgunned, caught in the open against a prepared enemy. The Swedish army broke. For the first time in his reign, Charles XII experienced total defeat. His troops fled, scattered, surrendered in masses. By the time the battle ended, the Swedish army had effectively ceased to exist. Perhaps 1,500 Swedes were dead. Another 3,000 or more would die of wounds. Nearly 19,000, almost the entire remaining army, were taken prisoner. Charles himself barely escaped, carried on his stretcher through the chaos. Protected by a bodyguard of loyal soldiers, he managed to reach the Dnieper River with roughly 1,000 survivors. They crossed into Ottoman territory, throwing themselves on the mercy of the Sultan. Peter the Great stood victorious on the field at Poltava. The battle that had haunted him for 9 years, the humiliation of Narva, had finally been avenged. The Great Northern War wasn't over, but it would never be the same. The man who arrived in Ottoman territory in July 1709 was a very different figure from the triumphant conqueror who had dictated peace to Augustus the Strong just 3 years earlier. Charles XII was wounded, exhausted, and accompanied by barely 1,000 ragged survivors of what had once been the most feared army in Europe. He had lost everything: his army, his conquests, his aura of invincibility. The teenage king who had terrified 3 empires was now a refugee, dependent on the hospitality of the Ottoman Sultan. Most men in this situation would have accepted reality. They would have negotiated whatever peace they could get, salvaged what remained of their kingdom, and tried to rebuild. The war was clearly lost. Sweden's Baltic Empire was already crumbling. Russian forces were advancing everywhere. The rational thing to do was cut losses and survive. Charles XII was not most men. Instead of returning home to defend what remained of his kingdom, Charles stayed in Ottoman territory for 5 years. 5 extraordinary, maddening, almost incomprehensible years, during which the King of Sweden sat in exile while his empire collapsed around him, pursuing one obsessive goal: convincing the Ottoman Empire to declare war on Russia. If the Ottomans attacked from the south, Charles reasoned, Peter would be caught between 2 enemies. The pressure would force Russia to the negotiating table. Everything could still be salvaged. Everything could still be won. It wasn't an entirely crazy strategy. The Ottoman Empire was one of the few powers capable of matching Russia in a full-scale war. And there were genuine tensions between Constantinople and St. Petersburg, conflicts over borders, over influence, over the fate of various contested territories. An Ottoman war against Russia wasn't impossible, but Charles pursued this goal with a single-mindedness that bordered on mania. He established himself in the town of Bender, in what is now Moldova, and essentially set up a Swedish court in exile. He maintained elaborate correspondence with Ottoman officials. He schemed, negotiated, bribed, and pressured. He refused every suggestion that he should return to Sweden. His own advisors were appalled. His own government was desperate. Sweden was bleeding, losing battles and territory. Every month Charles remained absent. The kingdom needed its king. Charles stayed where he was. To understand what was happening in the Baltic while Charles sat in Bender, you have to understand how completely the strategic situation had reversed. Before Poltava, Sweden had been the dominant power in the region. Swedish forces had occupied Poland, humiliated Denmark, and threatened Russia itself. The Swedish navy controlled the Baltic Sea. Swedish garrisons held key fortresses throughout the empire. After Poltava, everything collapsed. Augustus the Strong, seeing the Swedish army destroyed, immediately renounced the Treaty of Ultronstadt and reclaimed the Polish throne. The puppet king Stanisław Leszewski, without Swedish troops to support him, fled into exile. Poland-Lithuania returned to the anti-Swedish coalition. Denmark, emboldened by the news from Ukraine, re-entered the war. Frederick IV saw the opportunity to reclaim everything Denmark had lost to Sweden over the past century. Danish forces began operations against Swedish territories in Germany, and Russia was everywhere. Peter's forces swept through the eastern Baltic like a tide. Swedish garrisons, unsupported and outnumbered, fell one after another. The great fortress cities that had been the backbone of Swedish power, Riga, Reval, Viborg, were captured by Russian armies. Finland itself was invaded. The Swedish Baltic Empire, built over a century through blood and iron, was being dismembered in a matter of years. And the king who might have organized resistance, who might have rallied his remaining forces, who might at least have made the conquest more costly, that king was sitting in Ottoman territory, obsessing over diplomatic schemes. There was one moment when Charles's strategy seemed to work. In 1710 and 1711, Ottoman-Russian tensions did finally boil over into war. The Sultan, moved by a combination of Swedish diplomacy, genuine strategic concerns, and internal political pressures, declared war on Peter the Great. The result was the Pruth River Campaign and one of the strangest episodes of the entire Great Northern War. Peter, overconfident after Poltava, personally led a Russian army into Ottoman territory. It was a massive miscalculation. The Russian force was surrounded by a much larger Ottoman army along the Pruth River. Trapped, outnumbered, running out of supplies, Peter faced the very real possibility of complete defeat, perhaps even capture. This should have been Charles's moment of triumph. If Peter were captured or killed, if the Russian army were destroyed, everything could change. The coalition against Sweden might collapse, the lost territories might be recovered. But the Ottomans, for reasons that remain somewhat murky, chose to negotiate rather than fight. Peter's wife, Catherine, allegedly bribed Ottoman officials with her jewels. The Grand Vizier, perhaps skeptical of the reliability of his own troops, agreed to peace terms that allowed the Russian army to escape. Charles was furious. He had been so close. The Ottomans had held victory in their hands and let it slip away. He demanded that the war continue, that the Sultan recognize the opportunity that was being squandered. The Ottomans were done. They had their peace. They had no interest in continuing a war for Swedish interests. Charles remained in Bender anyway. What followed was one of the most bizarre episodes in the history of European royalty. By 1713, the Ottomans had lost patience with their Swedish guest. Charles had been living on Ottoman hospitality for 4 years, constantly pushing for renewed war against Russia, constantly refusing to leave. The Sultan finally decided to force the issue. Charles would be encouraged to depart Ottoman territory. The encouragement took the form of an armed force, several thousand Janissaries and Tatars sent to Bender to escort the Swedish king to the border. Charles refused to go. What happened next became known as the skirmish at Bender, or, more colorfully, the Kalabalika Turkish word roughly meaning tumult or riot. When Ottoman troops approached the small compound where Charles and his remaining Swedes were staying, the king ordered his men to resist. This was insane. Charles had perhaps 40 loyal Swedes against several thousand Ottoman soldiers. The situation was hopeless by any rational measure. Charles didn't care. He would not be forced. He would not show weakness. If the Ottomans wanted him to leave, they would have to drag him out. The fighting lasted for hours. Charles personally led the defense, sword in hand, as Ottoman troops stormed the compound. When the buildings caught fire, Charles continued fighting in the burning ruins. He was eventually overwhelmed, dragged out of the wreckage, and taken prisoner, but only after the Ottomans had suffered dozens of casualties trying to capture a handful of Swedish diehards. It was madness. It was also, in its own strange way, magnificent. Charles XII, king without a kingdom, exile without hope, had chosen to fight the Ottoman Empire itself rather than submit to a perceived indignity. The Ottomans, perhaps impressed despite themselves, treated Charles well after his capture. He was held in comfortable conditions and eventually released. But the message was clear: his welcome had expired. In November 1714, after more than 5 years in Ottoman territory, Charles XII finally began the journey home. The Sweden that Charles returned to in late 1714 was a shadow of the empire he had left. The Baltic provinces were gone. Estonia, Livonia, Ingria, all in Russian hands. Finland was partially occupied. Swedish Germany was under attack from multiple directions. The treasury was empty. The army was a fraction of its former strength. And yet, somehow, Sweden was still fighting. The Swedish people, the Swedish government, the Swedish military they had held on through 5 years of disaster without their king. It had been a desperate, grinding defensive struggle, but Sweden had not surrendered. The core kingdom remained intact. Charles threw himself into the war with renewed energy. He was 32 years old now, no longer the teenage prodigy, but still utterly convinced of his own invincibility. The setbacks, the losses, the years of exile, none of it had changed his fundamental character. He was still the same stubborn, aggressive, uncompromising commander who had attacked Russia against impossible odds. The difference was that now the odds were even worse. Charles focused his efforts on Norway, then under Danish rule. If he couldn't recover the Baltic Empire, perhaps he could compensate by conquering Norway instead. It was a questionable strategic priority. Norway was poor compared to the lost Baltic territories, but Charles was no longer capable of accepting that the war might be unwinnable. The Norwegian campaigns were brutal. Swedish forces pushed into the mountains, fighting in some of the most difficult terrain in Europe. There were victories, but no decisive breakthroughs. The Norwegians resisted fiercely. Danish reinforcements arrived. The war ground on. Through 1716, 1717, and into 1718, Charles kept fighting. He imposed crushing taxes on the Swedish population to fund his armies. He drafted men who couldn't be spared. He bled his kingdom white for a war that, by any rational assessment, could no longer be one. Some historians have tried to diagnose Charles XII in retrospect. Was there something psychologically wrong with him? Did the years of war, the wound at Poltava, the trauma of defeat, break something in his mind? Or was he simply the logical endpoint of his own philosophy, a man who had defined himself entirely through warfare, who literally could not imagine any other way of being? We'll never know for certain. What we know is that Charles XII would not stop, could not stop. The war would continue until he achieved victory, or until something stopped him permanently. On November 30th, 1718, Charles XII was inspecting siege works outside the Norwegian fortress of Fredrikstad. It was evening. The king was in the trenches, observing the progress of the siege, exposed to enemy fire as he had been countless times throughout his career. Charles had never shown any concern for his personal safety. He had been wounded multiple times, had horses shot under him, had fought in the front lines of a dozen battles. He seemed to believe he was somehow immune to the dangers that killed ordinary men. A single shot rang out. Charles XII fell, struck in the head. He was dead before he hit the ground. He was 36 years old. He had been at war for virtually his entire adult life, 18 straight years of continuous combat, and now it was over. The circumstances of his death have been debated ever since. The bullet that killed him came from the direction of the fortress, but was it a Norwegian shot, or was it fired by someone much closer? Some historians believe Charles was assassinated, murdered by Swedes who were desperate to end the war he refused to stop fighting. The forensic evidence is inconclusive, and the truth may never be known. What is known is that Charles XII's death ended the Great Northern War. Without the king's iron will driving them forward, Swedish forces had no reason to continue fighting a war that could not be won. Peace negotiations began almost immediately. The treaties that followed signed at various points between 1719 and 1721 formally dismembered the Swedish Empire. Russia received the lion's share of the spoils. The Treaty of Nystad in 1721 transferred Estonia, Livonia, Ingria, and parts of Finland to Russian control. Sweden's century of Baltic dominance was finished. Peter the Great had won. Russia was now, unquestionably, the supreme power of the Baltic region. Denmark recovered some territories. Prussia took parts of Swedish Germany. Everyone who had started the war to grab pieces of the Swedish Empire got what they wanted. Sweden itself survived, but as a secondary power, the age of Swedish imperialism was over. The Swedish meteor, as some historians call this period of expansion and dominance, had burned itself out. So what do we make of Charles XII? It's a question that historians, philosophers, and military theorists have been debating for 3 centuries. Was he a genius or a lunatic? A hero or a villain? The greatest warrior of his age or the man who destroyed his own kingdom? The honest answer is that he was all of these things, depending on when you looked at him. The Charles XII who burst onto the European stage in 1700 was genuinely extraordinary. The speed of his decision-making, the audacity of his tactics, the personal courage he displayed, these weren't the qualities of an ordinary commander. He really was something special. The victory at Narva really was one of the most remarkable military achievements in history. The early campaigns really did demonstrate a kind of genius. But genius without wisdom is just a more spectacular form of destruction. Charles never learned. That was his fatal flaw. He couldn't adapt, couldn't recognize when circumstances had changed, couldn't accept that the strategies that had worked against Denmark and Augustus might not work against a reformed Russia. His stubbornness, which had been an asset when he was winning, became a catastrophe when the situation turned against him. He spent 6 years pursuing Augustus when Russia was the real threat. He invaded Russia without adequate supplies or preparation. He refused to retreat when retreat was the only sane option. He spent 5 years in Ottoman exile when his kingdom needed him. He kept fighting long after the war was clearly lost. Every one of these decisions made sense in the context of Charles's psychology. He couldn't compromise because compromise was weakness. He couldn't retreat because retreat was surrender. He couldn't make peace because making peace meant admitting he hadn't won. In the end, he would rather die in a frozen trench outside a Norwegian fortress than accept that his war had failed. There's a famous story about Voltaire and Charles XII. Voltaire, the great French philosopher, wrote a biography of Charles that became one of the most popular books of the 18th century. It shaped how Europeans understood the Swedish king for generations. And in that biography, Voltaire tried to draw a moral from Charles's life. The moral, as Voltaire saw it, was about the dangers of excessive ambition and military glory. Charles had possessed every quality that should have made him great courage, determination, military brilliance, but he had lacked the one quality that matters most, knowing when to stop. His very virtues had become vices because they were never tempered by prudence. But there's another way to read Charles XII's story, a darker way. Charles didn't fail because he was stupid. He didn't fail because he lacked intelligence or ability. He failed because he was constitutionally incapable of being anything other than what he was. He was built for war. War was his identity, his purpose, his reason for existence. Asking Charles XII to make a sensible peace was like asking a fire to stop burning. And that's the truly terrifying thing about his story. It suggests that some forms of greatness are inherently self-destructive. That the same qualities that allow someone to achieve extraordinary things can also prevent them from knowing when to stop. that there's a thin line between glorious ambition and suicidal obsession, and Charles XII crossed it somewhere in the snows of Poland without ever realizing it. Peter the Great, by contrast, understood something Charles never did. Peter wanted to win, that's all. He didn't care about glory for its own sake. He didn't care about personal honor or the principles of warrior kingship. He wanted to modernize Russia, and he wanted access to the sea, and he was willing to do whatever it took to achieve those goals, including accepting humiliating defeats, making tactical retreats, and waiting patiently for his moment. Peter lost at Narva. He nearly lost at the Pruth. He spent years building strength while Charles was distracted in Poland. And in the end, Peter won because he was willing to be flexible, to learn, to adapt. Charles XII was the meteor brilliant, spectacular, and ultimately self-consuming. Peter the Great was the glacier slow, patient, and utterly unstoppable. The glacier won. Today, Charles XII remains a controversial figure in Sweden. For centuries, he was celebrated as a hero, a symbol of Swedish martial glory, the warrior king who never surrendered. Statues were erected, songs were sung, his memory was invoked in times of national crisis. The Great Northern War changed the map of Europe. It ended Swedish dominance and began Russian supremacy in the Baltic. It transformed Russia from a backward medieval kingdom into a modern European power. It created new nations and destroyed old empires. And at the center of it all was a teenager who thought he could take on 3 empires at once. He almost did. Almost. In the end, that's the word that defines Charles XII's entire life. Almost conquered Russia. Almost won the war. Almost achieved the glory he spent his entire existence pursuing. But almost only counts in horseshoes and hand grenades. In war, in history, in the cold judgment of time, almost means you lost. Charles XII lost. But he lost so magnificently, so dramatically, so completely on his own terms, that we're still talking about him 300 years later. Perhaps that's its own kind of victory. Or perhaps it's just the final, cosmic joke that a man who cared about nothing but winning is remembered mostly for the spectacular nature of his defeat. The snow still falls on the field at Poltava. The fortress at Fredrikstad still stands. And somewhere in the mythology of nations, a teenage king still rides at the head of his cavalry, charging into impossible odds, refusing to stop, refusing to surrender, refusing to be anything other than what he was. The teenager who took on 3 empires and almost won.